The first years of the NBA, the former NBL teams dominated. The players were the best and their teams were the best. But at the NBA's, we could call it a business plan, their plan was to show how big league they were. And Oshkosh and Fort Wayne didn't look like something you want to brag about as big league.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Hey everybody, how are you? Thank you for coming back to visit our little podcast. We call it Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast that is devoted to what used to be in professional sports. And in a world that's seemingly gone kablooey and haywire and all kinds of craziness out there, hopefully a little comfort food for you in the realm of sports history and nostalgia as we wend our way through stories and teams and leagues that for whatever reason don't exist anymore, and our little journeys into investigating why and how, and perhaps little stories that are frankly a little too early forgotten, easily forgotten, and we seek to shine some light on them and remember them, and perhaps even unearth some new tidbits that were not known before. We thank you for coming back. If this is a return visit for you, and if it's your first time in our little journey together, we appreciate you giving us a try, and we hope we entertain you for the next hour and change. Today's guest is our old pal Murry Nelson, our second return visitor. We previously chatted with Murry in an earlier episode about the American Basketball League and the role of Abe Saperstein in that league, he being of the management of the world-famous Harlem Globetrotters back in the day, and very interesting conversation. We encourage you to go back into the vaults to find that episode with Murry. But today we're talking about the National Basketball League, which is a very important topic for any professional basketball fan in today's modern-day NBA, and the recognition that the NBL, the National Basketball League, which was around 1937 to 1949 or so, which merged in 1949 with the then fledgling 3-year-old Basketball Association of America, or BAA. It is the merger of those two leagues, the NBL and the BAA, that netted, no pun, perhaps pun, the modern day, or the beginnings of the modern day, National Basketball Association, which launched from it. The NBL, very interesting stories and the little tidbits, not the least of which was a largely Midwestern league and industrial roots, teams that were comprised of workers from companies big and small, including places like Goodyear and Firestone and General Electric, who would proverbially work by day and play the game of professional basketball by night and weekends, all across the Midwest. A bit of exposure, not only in cities like Chicago and Minneapolis and Detroit and Cleveland, big cities you would imagine, but also small little hamlets that uniquely made up some of the quality players and play of the NBL. Places like Sheboygan, Wisconsin, the Tri-Cities in Iowa, Waterloo, Iowa, Anderson, Indiana, Hammond, Indiana, probably the basketball mecca in 1937, 1938, Akron, Ohio, where the Firestone and Goodyear teams were located. Just an amazing array of cities, big and small, and the players that comprise the National Basketball League. We're going to get into that topic, the history of the legacies, plural, of the NBL, a couple of dozen of all-star players that are part of now the Naismith Professional Basketball Hall of Fame, and frankly, 5 franchises that exist in today's NBA with direct ties to the origins of those franchises in the NBL. And those in particular are, if you're a fan of the Los Angeles Lakers, the Sacramento Kings, the Detroit Pistons, the Atlanta Hawks, and of course the Philadelphia 76ers. All of those modern day teams directly root themselves in the early days, the beginnings of the National Basketball League. Our topic in this conversation with Murry Nelson coming up in a couple of seconds. Again, we are sponsored by our friends at Audible, the audiobook company that it just continues to amaze. We've had a few folks from our previous episodes give Audible a try through our little website here, audibletrial.com/goodseats. And they have enjoyed, as you can too, a free audiobook download for your enjoyment, as well as 30 days of the free trial of the Audible audiobook service. You will find over 180,000 titles to choose from in lots and lots and lots of different genres and topics. The Audible titles play on just about every device that you can think of. And it's a great way to pass the time when you're not listening to your favorite podcast, of course. That's audibletrial.com/goodseats. You will get your free 30-day trial of the Audible service, as well as a free audiobook download to enjoy. You can cancel at any time. Give it a try. Again, a number of our friends, our listeners, have given it a shot, and we hope you will do the same. And I guarantee that you will enjoy listening to audiobooks courtesy of our friends at Audible. We appreciate Audible for their sponsorship of the show, and that's really cool, right? Sure, of course. All right, so our promotional stuff out of the way. Let's not waste any more moments and get right to our conversation with, again, our return visitor, Murry Nelson, and our discussion about the NBL, the National Basketball League of the late 30s and most of the 1940s, coming up right here on the show. I'll be honest, our second repeat customer here on the big show. And obviously we had a very compelling and fun conversation when we talked about the old ABL and Abe Saperstein. But there's no doubt that the beginnings of pro basketball, as we know it today, actually started certainly much earlier. And one of your other works is about the National Basketball League, which was a very important and oft forgotten tributary to what is today's National Basketball Association. So before we sort of get there, remind our audience your professional background and how you skated into the world of basketball and basketball history in particular.
Well, I'm a professor emeritus of education and American studies, and one of the foci that I've often had, and always had actually, since I was in junior high, has been basketball history. And in that vein, I've been teaching a course, or I have taught a course, on the rise of the American sport hero between the wars, which used one of my books, my first basketball book, which was the one on the original Celtics, which I was very interested in because I wanted to read a book on the original Celtics, and there wasn't any, so I ended up doing the research and writing that. In the context of that, I kept overlapping with other players who had been on that team who had become NBA or college coaches, and kept bumping into more on the National Basketball League, and again was interested in that. But that was about it. But what really infuriated me was when the NBA declared its 50th anniversary in 1996 and completely ignored that the NBL had existed. And I was so irritated by that I wrote a letter to Sports Illustrated, because they had bought into this, and said that this was simply not true. Either you accept that the NBL was one of, if not the forerunners of the NBA, or you pretended that the NBL didn't exist, because that just didn't make sense, that it could be ignored. And the letter was seen by a guy named Dick Tripto, who had played at DePaul and been George Mikan's roommate when they had been at DePaul, and then they had played together in the NBL later for the Chicago Gears that won an NBL title. The Chicago Gears did not exist for very long, but Dick wrote to me and said how much he enjoyed the letter and introduced himself, and we got friendly, first by mail and then by phone, and then eventually meeting each other and becoming what I considered, I was honored to be a good friend to Dick. And that set me off on being interested in researching more on the NBL and being able to talk to some of these guys who were still alive at that time. In many cases, they would have been harder to find, if not impossible, if not for Dick's intrusion, because he knew many, if not all of them. And of course, talking to Mikan, who was hard to find and wasn't really into interviewing at that point, he would talk to me because of Dick. So almost all of my interviews that I had in the NBL book, which were great fun for me, were set up by Dick Tripto. And then Dick's materials, Dick had written a book on the Chicago Gears that came out after my NBL book, that he had used so much of his own material. And when I went to his house, and he lived in Lake Forest, and I was happy to do that because I went to high school in Deerfield, and then we played against Lake Forest, and he had coached. So it was really fun when I occasionally go back to Chicago to be able to go and visit Dick, and that just got me going, and I started doing the research, and the research would involve both some of the great interviews that Dick would set up for me, and I'd do them with him and with me and with my staff assistant and whomever it was that we were interviewing. And I saw Dick's materials at his house, and then I suggested that he accompany me on one of my trips to archives in Sheboygan and in Oshkosh. And we had a great time. I got to go through all these materials and spend more time with Dick. So that was really how I got interested, and that was how the book got going. It was all from the NBA being semi-ignorant, if not just totally exclusive, and forgetting about the existence of the NBL as one of its co-founders.
All right, so a couple of hints there that we're going to get to in the course of our conversation. One of them, of course, being the importance and significance of the Midwest in not only the NBL's creation and evolution, but obviously what became of ultimately the tributary into the NBA as well. And you mentioned a couple of towns. We're going to get to that in a couple of seconds. But first, so this is interesting because I think you're basically saying is that you had quite a few access points to original source material via direct interviews with some of these players and actors, so to speak, in the NBL's existence, yes? Yes,
and I think probably, unless they've lived to be over 100, I think probably every guy that I interviewed has now passed away, and I got some interaction by letters with a few people. I had some correspondence with John Wooden, who also played in the NBL, and of course John is gone also, but his letters to me were very gracious and useful. So yes, this was indeed something that was able to be done able to be done as well because of the interviews with these people who were engaged and could describe the venues and the kind of play they had. It was enlightening and fun for me.
Well, so let's get into how the NBL sort of became the NBL. Obviously, like a lot of leagues and situations, there was some prelude, shall we say, about the situation around, let's call it professional basketball. Maybe it wasn't even that prior to the NBL coming into existence. You want to give our audience a bit of a sense of sort of the primordial ooze, I guess, by which the NBL effectively got started?
Well, the NBL was originally, if we want to connect that as original, was the Midwest Conference, starting in 1935. The Midwest Conference was a professional league that was the top professional league, and there were little professional leagues all over the East and the Midwest. Most of them weren't much, but there were really two hubs for professional basketball in the 1930s and the 20s. and that would have been the Midwest and the Northeast. And most players who were playing had other jobs. It was hard to make a whole lot of money playing professional basketball, but they did, and the games were scheduled such that one could hold a real 9-to-5 job and play basketball probably 2 or 3 nights a week. Since the leagues were regional, they would be able to get back to work the next day because the travel wasn't terribly far. And the train system that we had in the United States at that time was actually very good. You could count on the train getting you to someplace and back. And most of the players, the teams didn't travel generally as teams. They traveled individually, and they would hook up wherever it was. And so that it was important to be able to know the train schedules, and most of the players had them memorized. And starting in about 1935, the Midwest Conference began with players who wanted to continue to play ball, mostly because they loved to play ball and they wanted to play against the best competition, and because there were some, shall we call them benefactors, people who owned small businesses who enjoyed basketball, good basketball, and also saw that there was a way to kind of do some advertising for their own small business so they could sponsor the teams. Their names would be on uniforms, their names would be in the programs, and that would be something that everybody could enjoy, both we'd call them the owners and the players. Though they didn't own very much. They had to get rights to use various venues. What they owned was the equipment and a contract with independent contractors, players, who sometimes were also able to play on their own independently, although not for another team in the league. So that was in the 30s, and 35 started with the Midwest Conference with a number of teams that were sponsored by grocers, or in the case of Akron, there were 2 companies, Firestone and Goodyear, the tire companies, each of whom were sponsors of a team, and these teams were playing independently, and they ended up talking. That is, the owners, sponsors ended up talking and saying, let's put a league together, and they did that. It was loosely done. There was no minimum number of games that had to be played against other opponents in the league. They didn't have we would call it today an unbalanced schedule. And then ultimately there would either be a championship at the end of the year, or they just see who had the best record and call that champion. And some of those teams ended up playing in ultimately what was a world championship later on. But that existed for 2 years, and then that teams fell apart. That is, the sponsors couldn't keep it up or didn't wish to, and some did. And then there was kind of a melding into what would be a new league that was really built out of the Midwest Conference, and that was ultimately called the National Basketball League, starting in 1937. And the league itself signed the top players, and those players, as I said, had other jobs. Many were coaches. Many played in, would coach or would be working at regular jobs. John Wooden was the scoring champion of the Midwest Conference, and he was coaching in high school at the time. So that was a pretty familiar story. And the league ended up starting in 37 and moved from anywhere from 6 teams to 8 teams to 4 teams to up and down for the next 12 years.
Well, a couple of things here, right? We talked a little bit about some of this when we were talking about the ABL, even in the early 1960s, right? So the industrialness, shall we say, or the tight connection between industry and companies and firms, et cetera, and their sponsorship and then some around the sport of basketball, including the players and giving them essentially day jobs while they were able to play their night jobs of basketball was very, very strong. Yeah. I think maybe perhaps more pronounced almost than any other sport around that era, where working and playing basketball were so neatly tied. But what I'm also interested in too is that I think, as the league got started, there were three particular companies that seemed to make an imprint, and I'm curious as to maybe why. Perhaps you know, perhaps you don't. And that's GE, General Electric, Firestone, and Goodyear, which essentially, I think, became kind of sort of the ultimate, corporate sponsors and foundation for this league in 1937.
Well, there would be two reasons. One was just because some executives liked basketball, and they wanted to have closer contact with basketball, and we can't fully understand that today since we have television, internet, we have basketball leagues and teams playing all the time. But once you were finished with college, there wasn't as much basketball going on, and some of these executives still really had a hankering for the sport, and they had an opportunity to get their own teams together. It's kind of like fantasy league today, where you can get into a league and you can have players playing for you. Well, this was kind of a realistic version of fantasy, or a fantastic version of reality, whatever you want to call it. And the people who were in charge of management or certain areas of these companies convinced the company generally that this was a good thing. It got people out playing. It also kept their employees, both attending and employees who work for them, healthy. And it encouraged, and at least in Akron, in Firestone and Goodyear, they had set up gyms and facilities for their employees. They wanted to keep them healthy. And they were far ahead of the curve in knowing that if you kept your employees healthy, then they didn't lose sick days. So you had them working. So employees were generally using the facilities, and what they did is they hired guys who, most of the NBL players, again, were different in that they had attended college. This was new, so that they were employing people who had attended college. A number of them did not, but there were lots of jobs for people who didn't attend college, who had some ability to do something in the factories, and these were big industrial factories. So that it was in their benefit in terms of the overall picture of getting them to stay at work, that is, the players and the people who were from the company who would go out and support them, and it gave them advertising. So it was a good reason for them, and they had the facilities there, so they didn't have to search those out, at least in those companies, and it seemed to work.
That's interesting. It almost feels like it was an extension almost of sort of the morale or college spirit of the collegiate ranks, right? But only extended into the world of professional companies and corporations, right? Where the employees can feel good about the company and their participation, and becomes more of a lifestyle extension than it is sort of a second job, if you will. Indeed,
that is exactly the analogy you can draw. That these people, especially for some who might not have gone to college, and even those that did, they were able to identify with their company and with their players, and it built in loyalty. It probably was a good way to keep people working and wanting to work for the company, and it gave them an outlet to be able to go and see good sport if they're interested in sport, because this was the best basketball that was being played in the country.
So it sounds to me that some of the informality, I guess, of what you described in the Midwest League blended over into the beginnings of the NBL. And tell me if I have this right. So it seemed that, from what I can tell, the scheduling of the games, at least in the early year or two or three, I guess, was more at the discretion of each individual team. There was, I guess, an attempt to put some level of minimum games played so that there could be, even if it's still an unbalanced schedule, it would still be something along the lines where at least teams were playing at least 10 games or so, or a certain amount on the road. And interestingly, I think, and again, tell me if I have this right or wrong, There's, from what I can tell, there was a choice based on the home team's preference of how the game was actually going to be even played, right? Was it going to be 10-minute quarters, four 10-minute quarters, or interestingly, 3 15-minute periods? Do you want to sort of delve into some of those dynamics of how games might have even been played in those first years or two?
Well, it was, as you say. I've noted that they wanted to be loose enough so that there was some flexibility, but firm enough so that there would at least be seen as some equitability, that each team would not be, or that all of the teams were playing on basically the same footing. But some teams liked the 3 15-minute quarters, or that we would call them 3 15-minute periods, and for whatever reason, sometimes it was because the fans preferred that. They were used to that. The game was not, at that time, totally solid in the way it was divided. So there was a continual dynamic at that time. 15-minute quarter, the 3 periods, or the 4 periods of 10 minutes each. And we saw that carry over, actually, into more modern basketball with the way men's and women's games were played up until recently, that there were different rules and different ways of timing the game. And it's because when Naismith originally invented it, it was dynamic. There were always changes going on. It developed. We've seen over the short life, relatively speaking, of basketball over the last 120 years, that there have been a lot of changes that would have made the game difficult to recognize if you had been around in 1900. The game is different, but there's a lot of stuff that you'd say, oh yeah, I see the basics. I mean, just the development of dribbling and how much you dribble, the development of the equipment, and how much you would want to dribble with a ball that really didn't dribble very well, and the baskets themselves and the play itself. So there was a lot of dynamism in basketball at that time, which some people could say made for uncertainty, but the positives would be that it was always exciting and getting to see the game develop. So the teams and the league was, the executives were smart enough to see that they wanted to retain that. They didn't want to become calcified so quickly.
All right, so let's talk about that first sort of season or so. You made reference to one of the teams that clearly established its dominance in the earliest years of the NBL, that being the Oshkosh All-Stars. Do you want to give some sense of sort of the types of teams that are in this league at this time, and perhaps why Oshkosh, that major, gigantic metropolis in the Midwest, would rise to being such a dominant and forceful team in the league's early year or two?
Well, they were fortunate in Oshkosh, and every team, there was no draft, so you would be seeking out players, and consider the 1930s and the way you would find players. You would know them because they went to college, or you would know them because they didn't go to college and they were local. And most teams were trying to find players that would have local appeal. So again, not just the people from their own company, but the people in the region would want to go and see somebody play because they knew them. They appreciated basketball, but they appreciated even more when they knew somebody. Oshkosh had players who had some local contact, usually working there. The two top players, and I advocate this in my book on the NBL and continue to advocate it, that the two top players who have been screwed, as it were, who have been just ignored for the Basketball Hall of Fame, Leroy Edwards and Charlie Shipp, were dynamite players. And Edwards had gone for a year at the University of Kentucky, and he had been one of their top players, but apparently he wasn't that good a student. And the times were such that it was hard to maintain yourself in college when you had very little money. So players weren't going to college if they weren't able to afford it. There was not a basketball scholarship that was going to be given out. The early years of the NCAA were such that they didn't sanction or deal with any of this. So Edwards left. He was working, and he went to work in Oshkosh and play in Oshkosh. And Charlie Shipp was from the region, and he was probably the best defensive player, as well as a good offensive player, but the best defensive player in the league. And he came from that region of Wisconsin. And once they both ended up there with the rest of the team, they played a tough game. Now, the game, of course, was much different. Big players were anybody who was over 6'3". Edwards was the all-star center for any number of years in a row at 6'4" or 6'4.5". He was left-handed. He also led the league in nicknames because he was.
We always love that nicknames. Give us a few. I know one was Cowboy.
Cowboy and Lefty were his two. I don't want to say his favorites, but those were the most common. Then others had to do with his mountain background and his Kentucky background. But he was a rough player. George Mikan told me that he was the roughest guy he ever played against. He never said dirty, but he said he was just like a tree. Now remember that Mikan was 6'9" or 6'10", and was built pretty well also. And Edwards was 6'4.5", and George said that you couldn't move him. When you went for a rebound, he was immovable, and he had a great hook. He could hook right-handed, but his left-handed hook was almost unstoppable. And this is with Mikan saying that when he had 6 inches on the guy, or 5 inches at least. So Edwards was tough. He was quicker than you would think. He had a nice shot, and he led the league in scoring a number of years, and he was a first-team all-star player for at least 5 years, and he was on the all-star team, either first or second team, for almost every year that he was in the league.
There's also another thing that Leroy Cowboy Evans, or Lefty, however you choose to remember him, was responsible for that ultimately endured in the game and in the rule book, and that was the 3-second rule. Do you want to maybe give a little bit of a sense of? Well,
that was the same thing that Mikan said, that he was immovable. Once he got in there, if he posted low and they got him the ball, he was going to score because he was wide enough and quick enough that he would be able to score either with his left or his right hand. And there had to be something done, the league figured, to make it fairer. So they said you couldn't just camp in the lane. And they ended up making the 3-second rule, which was basically called initially the Edwards rule because of Leroy. And obviously it got picked up by other places, and then ultimately it has become a rule everywhere. The lanes may change, the Olympic lane being not a straight lane, but curved lines that go at an angle, but it's still the same rule. Guys can't camp in there. And if he was allowed to camp in there, if he missed, he'd get the rebound too. So they had to do something about it without taking it out on him personally, and that seemed to be the best notion.
So let's get a bit into why perhaps somebody so dominant and remembered as such was or is or still has not been brought up and inducted into the Basketball Hall of Fame. Is it because perhaps, and maybe we'll talk a little bit about this a little later on, the NBL has been, I want to say whitewashed, but essentially kind of de-emphasized in sort of as one of the tributaries to what is today the NBA and the quality of play?
Absolutely. There are two major reasons, and they're interrelated. One is there's nobody around who's who's on these committees, what are called old-timers committees now, who are old-timer enough to remember guys that played in the 30s and 40s. And so that play itself has been ignored, and the feeling is that anybody who was good has already been named for the Hall of Fame, the only exception being those players that might have been discriminated against because they were from African-American teams. And, of course, the Wrens and the Globetrotters have been put in as a team, so they didn't have to single out players. But, again, that was late coming. And the other reason, and the biggest reason, is, as you've noted, that the NBA was formed initially in 1946 when the BAA, which had the best venues and was in the big cities, combined with the NBL, which had the best players and was in smaller cities. And in fact, the NBL was really a source of pride and for small town America. But the BAA seemed to be better off financially. And they, in the merger, both leagues had all of their teams combined into the NBA. And that was initially 17 teams, which seemed a lot at the time. It doesn't today, but at that time, it was quite a bit because there were 8 and 10 teams. One team didn't make it, and that left 17 teams. But gradually over time, the NBL teams, the old NBL teams, could not keep up financially. It was too difficult. They couldn't pay as much because they were in smaller cities, and as travel became more difficult, because the railroads also started to decline too, and also it was farther. The NBL was in the Midwest, and the BAA was almost exclusively in the Northeast, where things were closer and the cities were bigger. And over time, the demands, financial demands, were not such that the NBL teams and the NBL owners could maintain themselves. And the BAA and the new NBA wanted to look like a real major league, which meant the top cities. And the top cities were not Oshkosh and Sheboygan and Fort Wayne and Toledo and the rest of the NBL. So they kind of, as you use the term whitewash, they kind of just pushed that aside and said that that was a different league. The NBA starts with the BAA, and they go back to the years of the BAA, 46, rather than the merger in 49. And so those early NBL years, and even some of the merger years, were looked down upon, even though the first years of the NBA, the former NBL teams dominated. The players were the best, and their teams were the best. But the NBA's, we could call it a business plan, their plan was to show how big league they were. And Oshkosh and Fort Wayne didn't look like something you want to brag about as big league.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting because we're talking circa 1937 when the NBL launched, and the BAA did not launch until 1946, as you mentioned. Yeah, there were some big cities, obviously the Minneapolises and Chicagos of the world, right? But Waterloo, Iowa, and the Tri-Cities, and Kankakee, Illinois, Hammond, Indiana, and Whiting. You had Flint. You had Anderson, Indiana, Richmond, Indiana. These are just Akron, right? Which actually seemed to be almost in the earliest couple of years of the NBL, probably seemed to be almost like Basketball City, USA, because you had both of the Firestone and Goodyear teams and marketing geniuses naming both of them, the Firestone non-skids and the Goodyear wingfoots, right? They were perennially the first couple of years quite good. I'm sure the rivalry was very strong, but here it was happening in the relatively smaller metropolis of Akron, Ohio, versus, say, a place like Cleveland or Detroit or even Syracuse or even Rochester, which are far bigger, or Buffalo.
Yes, and those teams were even bigger, relatively speaking. Those cities were bigger, relatively speaking, then than they are today. Like Rochester really was a more important city, and I'm not trying to demean Rochester, but it just doesn't have the same cachet that it did in the 1940s. So it didn't look, as far as the people who were involved leading the league, and they were from Boston and New York, for the most part, they didn't want to be associated or seem to be associated with such podunk towns. And so they chose not to be, and they just kind of revised their own history.
Well, let's talk about a bit of those sort of podunk towns, because frankly, a lot of those smaller places, right, were not only some of where some of the best basketball was coming from, but frankly, some of the more ingenious owners and visionaries. One in particular being somebody who would actually be quite prominent in keeping the NBA when it was merged and evolved from in the years down the road. And that was Fred Zoellner, the owner of the aptly named Fort Wayne Zoellner Pistons. And perhaps maybe that's a good time to start talking about his role in all of this as the league sort of went through its first couple of years, as well as his team's role in significantly winning a bunch of things and some of the players that were brought to bear from it.
Well, Zoellner joined the Zoellner Pistons were not an original team in the NBL, but they joined fairly quickly. And there's a really good book which was helpful for me. The Zoellner Pistons were, as I said earlier, his factory, his company, the Zoellner Piston Company, believed in the same thing that I talked about earlier, that they wanted to have healthy facilities and healthy players. So they had teams and they had facilities right on their campus, as it were, and they had great baseball teams and great basketball teams. And the person who was in charge of all that, Roger Nelson, did write a book called The Zoellner Piston Story, which details a lot of this. And Fred Zoellner loved sports and wanted to see the league succeed once his team joined. Now, most of the teams, or many of the teams, really were barnstorming teams initially. And if they weren't, they did barnstorm even when the league was in season. The number of league games would vary from 24 to 40, but there was time for barnstorming, particularly within the Midwest, where you could be away and you'd be supported by your company in order to do that. Fred Zoellner recognized that and he supported it. And when his team came into the league in the early 1940s, 1941, when they were doing tremendous business, that is, the Pistons were, because this was the onset of war. And then during the war, they were extremely busy doing all of the piston work for World War II for airplanes and tanks and jeeps. So the Zoellner Piston Company was doing great, and he wanted the league to succeed. And there was a short time when the league could not have enough teams, and that would have been during the mid-40s. And he basically supported the entire league. It was necessary because 1941-42 there were only 6 teams in the league, and half of them couldn't have supported themselves. But he would kick in enough money to keep it going. And it wasn't seen as a conflict of interest. His interest is in the success of the league. And it didn't buy his team a title, I should say too. They did win the title in 42-43 when there were only 5 teams. So it ended up being 4 teams. But he supported the 2 Wisconsin teams and the Chicago Studebakers, who again were being successful as a factory at that time because of the war.
He was also responsible, or at least his team management was also responsible for bringing in perhaps arguably the best or one of the best players in the league's history, and a guy by the name of Bobby McDermott. You want to give a couple of moments of why McDermott was so important a figure in the NBL. He, though, actually making the Hall of Fame.
And he did. But he played for a lot of different teams, and he did play in the early years of the NBA. So the NBA claims him. But he started as a kid in the NBL when he was 18 or 19, and was a tremendous shooter, was incredibly fast and quick, and a tough defender and a good passer. And he was one of the early superstars of the league and played for Fort Wayne, and ultimately ended up on the Chicago Gears when Mikan came in, and that's when they ended up winning the NBL title because of the success of those players. That is, they were led by McDermott and Mikan. And McDermott could shoot from just about anywhere. Remember, we're talking mostly about two-handed set shots. And with the base that you have, his range was out to around 30 feet. And he was deadly from there. So it spread out the defense. And, of course, when you have a guy like Mikan inside, or any of the other players that would be inside players, when you've got to go out and guard a guy at 30 feet, there are a lot of holes inside. So it meant that his teams are successful, and McDermott was a great defender to prevent other teams from doing the same thing on his teams, whichever they were, Fort Wayne or the Gears later.
So at 30 feet, that sounds like that's 3-point territory and then some. You can imagine if there was a 3-point rule in place then, just what kind of scoring numbers he would have been putting up at that era.
Oh, indeed. Yeah, he was deadly, and Dick talked about what a tremendous shooter he was. That in practice he could shoot 10 in a row from that distance and make them. And would laugh about it.
Okay, friends, sorry for the interruption. Just wanted to quickly remind you that today's episode of Good Seats Still Available is brought to you by our friends at Audible, the premier provider of digital audiobooks with over 180,000 titles to choose from in just about every genre you could think of. Audible titles play on iPhone, Kindle, Android, and more than 500 devices and MP3 players for listening anytime, anywhere. And for a limited time, my audience can listen to a free download of any book that they choose, as well as get a 30-day free trial when you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats. That's audibletrial.com/goodseats. And you can choose from over 180,000 titles, as we said, including one that I'm listening to right now. It's called The 10-Gallon War by John Eisenberg. That's the story of the NFL's Cowboys, the AFL's Texans, and the feud for Dallas's pro football future. Another one on my list, which I have yet to download but is on my queue, that could be interesting to our audience here, is called The National Forgotten League by Dan Daly, entertaining stories and observations from pro football's first 50 years. Those are just two of the many thousands of titles to choose from, and not just in sports history, but you name the genre that you might want to listen to, and Audible's got it. By the way, two guests perhaps that we'll have on the show, hopefully sometime soon. But again, go to audibletrial.com/goodseats for your free 30-day trial, as well as your free audiobook download to try it out for yourself. Again, that's audibletrial.com/goodseats. And now, back to our conversation. So a couple of things here of note here, right? So which is a sort of a bigger theme here, right? So here's one example: the Fort Wayne Zollner Pistons, right? A direct descendant or a direct forebearer, I guess, of what today is known as the Detroit Pistons, and I think it's really important to understand that the NBL, based on my research, which is far more crack than your more professional version of such, right? But based on my my calculations, you've got at least 5 current NBA franchises that are direct or can be directly attributed to their time in the beginnings of the NBL, that being the Lakers of LA, obviously Minneapolis. We'll talk about them in a few minutes. The Sacramento Kings, which began their long and cursory journey in Rochester as the Royals. We talked about the Pistons now in Detroit. Buffalo, even the Buffalo Bisons and Tri-City Blackhawks. There's a merger along the way, which is really now the Atlanta Hawks. And again, we'll talk about them in a few minutes as well. Today's 76ers of Philadelphia beginning their journey as the Syracuse Nationals. So yet again, another question around sort of Hall of Fame and or NBA history treatment. You can't deny that these franchises, and there are obviously others that were part of further amalgams that wound up in the NBA and still are around today, or at least were part of. It seems really incredulous to me that you could deny a lot of the statistics and or contributions that the NBL and some of its franchises and players made, and including Hall of Fame recognition, et cetera.
Well, and that's exactly right, and it's infuriating to me when you see the teams and what they did when the NBL teams became part of the NBA, and they basically dominated, and then they continue to exist. And when you trace them back, as you just said, you see where they started, which was in the NBL, and you see some of the players and the abilities they had and where they came from and what they became. And some are in the Hall of Fame, like Bobby McDermott, and Mikan, Al Servey, who for many years was the heart of the Syracuse Nationals, Bob Davies, Red Holtzman played for Rochester, and of course he's in the Hall of Fame as a coach. Arnie Risen, who played for many years, he played at Kentucky and then played for many years also in the NBA. There's just too much to ignore yet. Indeed, it's ignored. One of my favorite pieces of NBL artifacts is that in 1948, the BAA had cards. They were Bowman Gum Company put out a set of cards in 1948 that was from the BAA, but so many of those players also had played in the NBL, and you can see in that set how important the NBL was. When the merger came, the Lakers moved as a team into from the NBL. Before the merger came, the Lakers had moved from the NBL to the BAA. So the year before the merger, the BAA managed to convince the Lakers to move into the BAA. So in terms of their history, the NBA claims, of course, that the Lakers were an original NBA franchise, and they were, but only because they'd been in the BAA for 1 year. They had been in the NBL for 2 years before that, and they'd been the Chicago Gears before that. So it's when you get to I guess it was Napoleon who talked about how the winners get to write history, and that's what we see here.
Interesting analogy. Don't know if Napoleon himself was a sports fan, but
he was not a basketball player.
Probably not, given his, shall we say, challenging stature. So before we sort of move on to the last sort of segment, or the last era, I guess, of the NBL, and you've hinted at some of those things. I think there's perhaps more. There's probably no better example of maybe in a microcosm the NBL and the small town nature, the small town Midwestern nature of some of the teams, and what then became of I guess that dynamic as not only the BAA came about, but then the merger and some of the pre-merger NBA merger hopping, shall we say, of teams to the bigger, more seemingly big city professional league of the BAA. And that's the Sheboygan Redskins. And for our audience, Can you give us who don't even know where maybe Sheboygan is? Maybe that you could give them a hint of not only where Sheboygan is, but perhaps why the Sheboygan Redskins perhaps are well worth noting in this bigger tableau of conversation.
Well, Sheboygan and Oshkosh, both of course are in Wisconsin, and Sheboygan had an interest in basketball before the NBL, and they had teams, amateur teams, and then a barnstorming team in Sheboygan. Sheboygan and Oshkosh, by the way, have great archives. The Sheboygan archives are incredibly helpful. They've got photos, and I have some of the photos in my book, and they had great artifacts, copies of contracts. I mean, getting to see this stuff and see how much people did or did not get for playing. Sheboygan was a growing Midwestern town in the early part of the century, the 20th century, and within the fold of the Midwest at that time, the league fit perfectly for Sheboygan. They could have the traditional rivalry of Oshkosh, which was maybe 75 miles away, and they also had Chicago, and as you mentioned, Kankakee. So the farthest from Sheboygan that they would go anyway would have been probably over to Akron. So when we think about distance, Sheboygan also was right on the railroad, which there may be a railroad in Sheboygan today, but it's certainly not a passenger railroad, and it doesn't go regularly. So Sheboygan, because of its location, it also was it's right on the lake also, so it had a lot of shipping. So that Sheboygan was a big, important town in the upper Midwest and was able to attract a lot of companies. And of course, the companies then could attract a lot of basketball players if they needed to have jobs, and people needed jobs, and basketball combined with factory work was an ideal location if you had not gone to college or if you had not graduated with a degree. And of course, even if you had, you could work in management. So that Sheboygan and Oshkosh were really the epitome of the places that the NBL represented. And it meant that these places were, to coin a phrase, big league. And I use that term a lot, that it was a way to be a recognized, important city without having all of the problems that places like Chicago and New York might have, that they were small towns in atmosphere, but big cities economically.
Yeah, and even winning the entire title in 42-43, beating those Pistons that we referenced earlier. But perhaps the coup de grace on that story is the fate, I guess, of some of the other smaller market teams, right? That did indeed, once the merger with the BAA and the formation of the NBA in August of 1949 occurred, you saw, those small market teams were part of the mix, which was great, but they didn't last past that first season, perhaps because of their small marketness. No?
Yeah, between that and then the farther travel, it wasn't going to work once they had the greater financial demands. And salaries had been driven up. One of the reasons for the merger is that salaries had been driven up because of the competition between the BAA and the NBL. Now, relatively speaking, it wasn't a lot of money, but for smaller towns, it was going to be more demanding, and for smaller factories. So that over the first 3 years of the NBA, almost all of the NBL teams had to go out of business, and there was really there was not the same kind of barnstorming that there had been before. But before they went, the NBL pioneered so many things, among which was integrated basketball in the professional ranks.
Yeah, I wanted to get to that. Yeah, maybe let's talk about that now. It's a very, very important point that we've glossed over thus far.
Well, the first team that was most important, the Chicago Studebakers, as I mentioned earlier, were obviously out of the old Studebaker plant that was in Chicago and was working for the war effort in 42-43, and the Studebakers were an integrated team of black and white players, and this had not happened before. And so this was, the NBA didn't become really integrated until the 1950s, and Major League Baseball until 1947. But in 1942-43, the Chicago Studebakers were an integrated team that played in the Midwest. And at the end of the NBL's existence, in 1948, another team, the great New York Renaissance team, was asked to take over a franchise that had folded in the middle of the season, the Detroit Vagabond Kings, and the Wrens, which was an all-black team, came into the league at that time and were the first all-black team to play in a professional league, mixed integrated league. So that there was the first were both basketball-wise and in terms of society. So the NBL has so much to warrant its inclusion, its teams and its players' inclusion in the Hall of Fame in so many different ways, but it just hasn't happened as much as it should have.
Now, the New York Renaissance are an interesting story, and I very much look forward to getting deeper into that story specifically, because there's much more to it than just their one almost full season in the last year of the NBL. But also known as the New York Renaissance or the Renaissance Big Five, the Wrens, are arguably as famous, if not more so, during the day and in terms of the quality of play as, say, folks like the Harlem Globetrotters, right, in terms of barnstorming and being all African American. I mean, the Wrens, really tried to, make their way into whatever level of professional basketball circuits there were, up to and including the NBL. And in many respects, their first and last, if you will, chance came when the NBL came a-calling to fill in a gap, and in some respects almost hastened the demise of the franchise, the Wrens, that is, as the league dissipated after that sort of final season. So kind of ironic that they finally, quote unquote, broke through, the Wrens did, as a professional circuit playing team, yet, only to go down or to be tossed aside as the NBL itself burrowed its way into the NBA, and the smaller teams and those less fortunate didn't hang on to continue.
And they were not invited into the league. And they probably, it's hard to tell if they would have accepted after the half year that they played as the Dayton Wrens, because they made so much more by being a barnstorming team. They were on the road all the time. Most of the guys lived in New York, but in that year they obviously had rooms in rooming houses in Dayton, but they traveled all the time, and they were superior. And in fact, the first world championship of basketball, of professional basketball, was won by the Wrens. And some of the great teams, and there's another book that focuses on the great rivalry between the Wrens and the Lakers, and that rivalry played itself out at least in the first World Professional Tournament, which the Wrens won. The Globetrotters ended up winning the second one. So it was kind of an indication that African American players could compete with the great white players, which had to be shown, just as it had to be in baseball, that the color you were was not a reflection of the quality of the play that you could level you could play at. And the Wrens, starting in New York and then playing in Dayton, and then they basically, as you said, that hastened their end. Many of the players stopped playing, or some ended up playing for the Globetrotters. They played for a few more years and were fabulous players. And I was fortunate enough to be friends with probably the last one who was alive, Johnny Isaacs. And John had some great stories, some artifacts, but mostly it was being able to talk with John and being able to be around him to find out more about the Wrens. And he visited me here, and we would get together at other times in other places. But the Wrens were just an incomparable team. They had some fabulous players, some of whom are now in, again, through what we might call the back door of old-timers or trying to get some of the African-American players through a different focal point into the Basketball Hall of Fame. So they have been recognized. But it was the NBL that gave them more prominence, because otherwise they were really only covered in terms of the media in what were black newspapers like the Chicago Defender.
Yeah, again, to me, fascinating story, and one that I'd like to go a lot deeper with. But perhaps in maybe we could sort of close this particular loop. Obviously, based in New York and Harlem, and they were replacing in the middle of the season or of such in 48-49, a team in Detroit that went sideways. Why Dayton then? So it wasn't Detroit and wasn't New York. It was Dayton. Any idea as to why the Wrens were plugged in there versus, say, their home in New York and or replacing the team, at least geographically, in Detroit, which is the team that they replaced?
Two reasons. One was that there was corporate and local sponsorship that were willing to do this. And the second was that it was convenient in terms of placement for the league. Dayton, Ohio was, again, right on the railroads. The railroads were one of the keys to the success of the NBL. And Dayton fit perfectly at that time. I mean, it's hard to believe today how important the railroads were, but they were.
Very interesting. All right, so let's segue then into sort of, I guess, the denouement, if you will, of the NBL. And we kind of hinted at perhaps one of the dominant components of the last years of the league, and that was a team known as the Rochester Royals. In particular, I'm sorry, my mistake. The Minneapolis Lakers, right? George Mikan, in particular, a towering figure, no pun, or maybe complete pun, in not only the NBL, but for what professional basketball looked like in the years to come. Do you want to talk about the Lakers in particular and George Mikan and his role and his influence in the latter days of the NBL, and then obviously what became of the remnants of that going forward?
Well, Mikan changed basketball because he was big and agile. Compared to today's players, he wouldn't be seen as agile, but compared to big players then, he was just quicker, had a wonderful touch inside, and he was able to dominate a game. He was 6'10", and there were no players that were 6'10" at that time. There were a few guys that might have been almost that tall, but they were lumbering oafs, and I don't mean to insult them, but in terms of their play, they were lumbering oafs. Mikan was fortunate enough to have outstanding coaching when he played at DePaul from Ray Meyer, who taught him footwork. And it was footwork that made Mikan the player that he was. And he and Dick Tripto played well together and were eager to continue to play well together as they did in Chicago. But Mikan ended up playing then for the Lakers once the Gears went out of business because they could not keep up financially. And Mikan combined initially with Bobby McDermott, but ultimately he was playing with with a number of guys who knew how to get him the ball, and a great jumping jack of a forward at the time, Jim Pollard. And Pollard was, the two of them were just rebounding machines, and it made a tremendous difference. The Lakers probably could have continued to dominate, would have dominated the NBL. When they went into the NBA, they were the dominant team in the NBA. First in the BAA for the 1 year, and then for the next few years in the NBA. The Lakers were just the best team, and they had the best players, and they had some great games against the Wrens, who were the other best team, except the Wrens were no longer in a league. And that meant that their games against the Wrens were fewer and farther between. But when they played, which was usually once or twice in a year, the games were memorable. And when they played for the World Championship, there used to be a tournament, the World Championship at the end of the year. There was an invited tournament and had players from all the professional leagues as well as the armed forces and AAU teams, and they would meet in a tournament that would determine who was the real professional champion. And the Lakers and the Wrens ultimately ended up being the champions more than anyone else until that died quickly, because leagues didn't like to be embarrassed. So if they weren't going to win it, they didn't want to continue to support it. And after a few years, the World Professional Tournament went out of business.
Yeah, and I think it's really important as a marker here in our little timeline that the importance of George Mikan as a player and as a dominating figure in the league and in basketball in general cannot be underestimated, because he was part of the Chicago American Gears and helped them win the title in 46-47, and then with the Lakers in 47-48. And it's important to remember, right, that the BAA, the Basketball Association of America, which we've been talking about over the course of our conversation, started in 1946, right? So here's the BAA with sort of their bigger aspirations and the big city sort of approach, and here's Mikan basically leading two different teams into the championship strata in those early years of the BAA's existence. But maybe this is also an important point. Maybe it's a footnote and it's an asterisk or whatever, but we love this stuff. Mikan didn't immediately go from Chicago 1 year to Minneapolis the second year. There was this thing called the Professional Basketball League of America. I don't know how much you came across this in your.
Well, that was where the Gears were, and that league. Dick talks about this in his book that they chose, and Dick's book is called "The Dynasty That Never Was." The owners of the Gears got together with others and decided that rather than go into this new NBA stuff or the new BAA, they would form their own league when the NBL died, and they would have the Professional Basketball League of America, and that was only in 47-48, and that was it. The league lasted a year, and it was finished. The Gears won that. The Gears then ended up going out of business, and the league went out of business. But it was there wasn't enough interest to support two basketball leagues as the NBL and the BAA found. And when the NBA started, or the BAA started, and the NBL was on its last legs, there wasn't any room for three, and there certainly didn't end up being any room for two either. But the PBLA was really the Gears, and Mikan dominated there.
Yeah, interesting. All right, so perhaps maybe you could give our audience a bit of a sense of sort of what drove what ultimately became, as we said before, in August 3rd in particular, 1949, in New York's Empire State Building, the ultimate merger, if you want to call it that, between the longer-standing NBL in its relative small-townness but high-quality player base and the, I guess, bigger aspirational city mindset of the BAA. Can you give us a sense of perhaps what drove the conversations around putting these two entities together and forming a sole National Basketball Association from such?
Well, it's as usual, the driving force was money, and that neither league was making a profit. The BAA had big cities and big venues, and the BAA had actually been started only because a hockey league, NHL owners, had the rights to the use of the venues in their cities, and they wanted to put something in there, and they started a basketball league. But it didn't have the players. The top players were in the NBL, and they were playing in smaller venues, making less money, but they were in the best league. And as the BAA started to raid the NBL, prices of salaries went up, but it was not sustainable. And and the NBL was snookered into thinking that the BAA had an advantage and they had more money. They might have, but they were losing more. So ultimately, they agreed to a merger. And the merger came out almost totally on the side of the BAA. All of the leading executives were former BAA executives, and that was unfortunate, but that was the way it was. Communication was pretty secretive in terms of who made what money, but ultimately the merger seemed to be good for the leagues, but not for the players, because they were going to have their salaries. You know, if we look at basic supply and demand, all of a sudden there was no more competition for their contracts, and the NBL faded, the BAA faded. Yet, as we said when we started this conversation, the BAA or the NBA, which was formed as a result of that, only used the BAA as its history. The NBL was non-existent. They would have called it a minor league, a semi-pro league. They could use any adjective that they wanted, but it wouldn't have been true. They were two upstanding leagues, one with great venues and mediocre players, the other with fantastic players and smaller towns and venues.
And made only more complicated when you look at through the lens of history and halls of fame and statistics and the usage of or the remembrances of or not, exacerbated right by the season prior to this merger actually happening, the 1948-1949 season, where you had 4 teams: the Lakers, Rochester, Fort Wayne, and the Indianapolis Cowboys. Best name ever. Yes, well named after Frank Kautsky, who owned the grocery store. There you go. Chain. There you go. So, and then some of the names of these teams are just tremendous. You can't make some of them up. Perhaps I think, by the way, my favorite was the Jim White Chevrolets of Toledo. Very catchy. Yeah, which then became, of course, the Jim White Jeeps in '46, right? Which, you wonder why those names did change. But my favorite has always been the non-skids, though, for a basketball team. Sure, non-skids. Why you couldn't have a better promotion for rubber, both in the soles of the tires being made as well as the sneakers making the noise on the court. But and the picture of a guy on the floor, not skidding. Not skidding, even better. But it just seems to be exacerbated by the fact you had those teams bolt for the BAA prior to the BAA actually kind of maybe not so even-handedly forcing sort of the merger. But I thought I picked up what you just said, that it was the hockey arena owners that were kind of the strings perhaps behind the BAA and more aspirational, even though they didn't have as much of the talent, say, as the NBL. Yeah, oh, exactly. Yeah, they were looking to fill their arenas because they had the rights to them and they were paying for them. So the more they could fill them, the more they would be able to get. Otherwise, they'd sit empty. And you don't make any money when you've got the rights to an arena and it's sitting empty. So it seemed like a logical way for them to find something that would fill the arenas on a regular basis, and that became the BAA. All right. So two final points to sort of maybe tie up some loose ends here. So when we talk about the records and the statistics, and we've said that before that the NBA does not officially recognize the NBL statistics, but it does recognize the BAAs. Is there any opportunity to reopen that conversation, that investigation, or has that door essentially been shut in terms of keeping the NBL and getting their statistics and whatnot sort of fully into the mix of historical lineage? I'm not an historian by trade, right? But I suspect that this is an issue within the fraternity that perhaps is still alive, or is it not anymore?
Well, it depends on whose recognition you want. The Hall of Fame, the Naismith Memorial Basketball Hall of Fame, has all that data and looks at it in that context. The frustrating thing to me is that, as I said earlier, the old timers aren't that old, and they've neglected now, and it's going to be hard. I've headed a campaign to try and get Edwards into the Hall of Fame because Leroy was that good. But I don't think we're going to see the NBA change that much. I don't see the NBA deciding that they're going to be inclusive of saying that records from the NBL will now be seen as part of the NBA. It provides no advantage as far as they're concerned. And I think some of the owners may think it diminishes their history because it makes them look smaller, which they are. But that's my old cynical approach.
And from what you can tell, how about we mentioned before some of those 5 direct team descendancies of the Lakers and the Kings, et cetera. Have there any of those franchises been especially good or unique in their memories or throwbacks of such, or have they been pretty much commandeered by the NBA in terms of their I guess their memories?
The Lakers have been the best, but the Lakers were a later franchise anyway. But they recognize why a team like that's located in Los Angeles would have a strange name like the Lakers anyway, because Los Angeles is not exactly known for its lakes.
Of course not. Yeah. Nor Utah with jazz, so to speak, right?
No, they do not have that association. But the Lakers have probably been the best. The thing that keeps most of this alive, thankfully, are good sports writers, journalists who have investigated and know and treat the history of these franchises in that manner. So we have the Sacramento Kings going back through being the Kansas City Omaha Kings and being the Cincinnati Royals before that, and back to the Rochester Royals. And those franchises recognize their own history and accept it in that manner. Now, I don't know how much they accept the NBL part of it, though, because I have not investigated how much they tout that. But since these teams went into the NBA, they do trace them back to that. Before that, it's hard to tell which part of their history they stop or begin at, because I haven't really asked, do you recognize the Rochester franchise of the NBL? It's not a pursuit I've made.
Yeah, see, to the casual sports fan, right, this seems like ephemera, right? But it's absolutely not, right? And when you have, in this case, I could make some. I could probably be convinced, in some of the other teams and leagues and sports that we've discussed and will discuss in the months ahead, where the link it was, or it could be a bit more sort of shaky or specious, right? But it's undeniable.
No, exactly.
Yeah, and the idea that these can't be sort of brought back into the fold as part of overall history. Look, I mean, 15 players that played in the NBL, right, are in the Naismith Basketball Hall of Fame. That's and 5 teams with direct lineages. I mean, that hard to believe that you can't incorporate what the NBL was and did, and even if it was sort of a bit more rustic and small town and whatnot. I mean, that's part of flavor of history. That the today's NBA wouldn't be around had much of that not happened.
No, precisely. And it was surprising to me when I saw that there was no recognition of that. I didn't originally intend to write a book on the NBL, but there wasn't any. And most of the basketball books I've written have been based on things that I wanted to know more about. And I figured I wasn't the only person that did. And so I ended up having the interest and the I don't want to say at the time, I made the time to pursue the research to put these books together.
Well, I for one think it's great, and I'm glad we're able to get together for yet another chat. And I think, frankly, people who live today in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, and Anderson, Indiana, and Waterloo, Iowa, three of the teams that did last for 1 year in that first NBA, will probably be most interested in tying that history back and clearly remembering that a bit more deeply. But so, Murry Nelson, your book is it's called The National Basketball League: A History, 1935 to 1949. It is available wherever good books are sold, including on Kindle. So if you want to get it electronically.
Yep.
What else are you, we've obviously talked about the ABL and Abe Saperstein. What else are you working on that perhaps our audience might be interested in, professional or otherwise?
Well, I had a book come out in January of this year on Big Ten basketball from 1943 to 1972. And that also, the pleasure of being able to interview some of these former players and coaches was wonderful for me. And it got into the times when I actually saw some of these players starting when I was in high school in the 1960s. And now I'm doing a sequel to that. I don't know how long it'll take. I don't know if I'll finish, but the intention is to do Big Ten basketball history from 1973 to 2000 and include both men and women. And I'm co-authoring that with a colleague from Cal State Sacramento who's focusing on the women's part, and we haven't figured out how we're integrating it, but we're working on it now, and we hope in the next 2 or 3 years we'll be done.
Any chance that the Big Ten television network could be part of those proceedings and perhaps getting a video and or documentary type stuff as well as the writing?
It's certainly possible. I have not contacted anybody in that regard until I've done research that I'm satisfied with. I don't want to say, let's do this and then not have answers. So I've had great cooperation from various athletic directors or athletic department offices at 8 of the 10 Big Ten universities. I'm not going to mention the 2 that I didn't get the same kind of cooperation, but I did get stuff in finding interviews and getting photos. And ultimately, I would like to see something covered on the Big Ten network, but that's a matter of getting somebody to say, we'll do this.
All right. So there it is. And our audience is, I don't know how vast it is, but it's very interesting how it gets into various nooks and crannies of people who actually have some sway in various places. So number one, with the NBA and the historians and how we remember the NBL, I think that's certainly item number one. But item number two, anybody who works, say, here in the Chicago area or is working in partnership with or part of the management of Big Ten Network, it sounds to me like you've got an historian who, in Murry Nelson, who can be very helpful in further documenting and perhaps helping in the programming of the origins and the history of the basketball contributions of the Big Ten. So hopefully our audience can, and obviously if you fit any of these two categories, just go to our website, goodseatsstillavailable.com. You'll be able to reach me, and I'm happy to put you in touch with Murry. But in the meantime, go buy some of his books, will you? Prove that our little show actually has some promotional value. And we thank you for Murry for being part of it yet again. And I look forward to hopefully a couple more opportunities if and when we can do so.
Well, thank you, Tim. Thank you for the show of support, and thank you for the discussion. It's always a pleasure.
See, there you go. Very interesting stuff. It always is in these chats. I always learn something, and frankly, I hope you out there in listener land are as well. We didn't even get to scratch the surface on some of these stories. Some of the team names are just all around terrific, and you can imagine what went into the naming of these teams and some of the marketing that went around them. But in Toledo, as we said before, the Jim White Chevrolets from 41 to 43, and then of course they were known as the Jim White Jeeps from 46 to 48. The Richmond King Clothiers must have been something. The Columbus Athletic Supply in Ohio. Yes, the team that lasted from the 1937 to 38 season. The Cincinnati Camellos. And, of course, the Anderson Duffy Packers, just to name a few. Some great names, some great stories, certainly some great players, and I think a bit of injustice, don't you believe, that some stronger and more official recognition by the NBA, the Naismith Basketball Hall of Fame, and all the sort of professional entities that control professional basketball today owe it to themselves, and I think the fans, and frankly, some of these towns and cities, to more deeply and robustly remember and commemorate the National Basketball League and the contributions of the teams, the players, the coaches, the owners, and all of the folks involved back in the one of the earliest tributaries to what is today's modern day NBA, National Basketball Association. So if you're listening out there in NBA land, if you have any pull with the Hall of Fame, and of course on the Big Ten front, as you heard Murray talk about his current work, Murry Nelson is the guy. And if you're not already connected to him or you want to learn more, just get in touch with me here at the show, and I'm more than happy to connect you in that process. The place, of course, to connect with me and our show, and the best place to do so is our website, which is goodseatsstillavailable.com. Make sure you spell it all correctly. Goodseatsstillavailable.com. That's where you find all the old episodes. You will find all the links to where to listen to the show. You will see links to the various books and movies and other items that we've referenced here for purchase or for follow-up. You will see various photos and all kinds of other sort of ephemera attached to our conversations as well. On social media, of course, you can follow us on Twitter at Good Seats Still. You can find us on Instagram at Good Seats Still Available. There you can like us on Facebook, all of those good things. And we, of course, want to thank the good things that come out of our friends at Podfly Productions, namely the production of this here little show, podfly.net, the folks there, Eric Begay, Corey Coates, David Gregerson, Jerry Payne, and all the good folks there at Podfly Productions. If you need some help, just even getting started with the idea of podcasting, Podfly is the place to go. I highly recommend them. Tell them that Tim Hanlon and or the Good Seats Still Available show sent you, and they're at podfly.net. Okay, so thanks very much for listening. We appreciate you doing so. Please tell your friends. Please rate and review us where you can. And we love the love you send us, and please keep sending it our way. We are encouraged and enthused by when you do so, and it gives us sustenance, if you will, to continue to do what we're doing, and we appreciate your cards and letters and suggestions. Until next week, we'll talk to you soon, and thank you again for listening. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.